I am grateful to have been invited to be a part of this. Christine, thank you. Donna, thank you. Hannah, thank you. The entire team who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, thank you, in order to pull this great effort together, which my hope is that this is just the start of something that will continue to reverberate, not just around this campus, but for those that you will ultimately become a model for. That is my hope. Before I get into anything, let me preface everything that I say that I flew in from the West Coast last night, so I am running on nothing but passion and caffeine. All right? So anything that I say, if I ramble, if I get too passionate, caught up in a topic, just let me know. All right? Also, I am going to give you a run for your money as well as your peers because I move around and I get animated, all right? So thank you as well. A little bit about myself. Hearing your bio is almost like hearing your voice. You're like, is that really me? Like, I don't sound like that. I don't look like that. That's not me. But a little bit more about myself. I am a professor of public relations and sport communication at San Jose State University out in the Bay Area. I do a tremendous amount of work around equity and inclusion and issues of race and gender equity within sports. I have a book coming out around emotional labor and the mental health of Black athletes that will come out next year. So hopefully when that comes out, you will have that as a supplemental text for some of your classes. Shameless promotion, all right? But how did I get here? I spent the better portion of my career doing communication, doing public relations in the corporate space. And the interesting part of how I came to creating my own consultancy, doing the passion work that I do around equity and inclusion, when I was doing communication for Volkswagen Group of America. There are no Volkswagen employees in here, right? All right. It'll be okay. And I remember I was doing communication, and there was a note that came out that we're starting, and we want to start employee resource groups. We're familiar with those, right? ERGs. And I raised my hand, of course, I want to volunteer to support the team. I said, where's the team? And they said, her. They said, Michelle, that's the team. And I said, I'm no math whiz, but I thought that a team certainly means more than one person doing this laborious work. And I realized that even a Fortune 10 company, which Volkswagen Group is, it's a global company. We were just a subsidiary of it, North American region. A Fortune 10 company that usually goes back and forth from being 1 and 2 in profitability in the world still didn't see the value in assigning resources to it. So you saw many individuals like myself coming from different parts of the organization, raising our hand to pull together sort of this Frankensteinian equity and inclusion group, which shouldn't be the case. Which brought me to the passion work that I do around equity and inclusion and working with different organizations, mainly corporate, but certainly within the academy, but also in the government sector. And the more that you may believe that that is not the norm, unfortunately it is. Unfortunately, I've seen far too much to support the notion that equity and inclusion is but an afterthought. It is but an option to have. And we're seeing a lot more of that play out, especially in these perilous economic times with corporate layoffs. But let me get back on topic because we have a lot to cover in this short amount of time that I am going to be in front of you. And I want to ensure that I somewhat lay the foundation for the excellent information from the speakers who are going to come behind me. That is my role today. Can you hear my voice? And when Donna and team mentioned to me that this is going to be the theme, I loved it. I loved it. But also a thought came to my mind as well. For a very long time, The voices of the historically marginalized, disenfranchised, suppressed, oppressed communities have echoed loudly. So the onus isn't on those communities of can you hear my voice? It's being reverberated across industries. I submit to you to consider, and this will be hopefully a reflection point for you all long after I am gone, is while championing the voices of the underrepresented will always be a point that we need to continue to rally around, I submit to you the thought process of, are you listening? Because can you hear my voice puts the onus on the marginalized. And while all of us, hopefully, we have a shared vision that we want to continue to champion those voices. We want to continue to bring visualization and amplification to those voices that for far too often have been suppressed. Far too often haven't even been defined. Can we just level set there? Can we just agree that many of us, and you don't have to raise your hand, just look straight, that many of us are still trying to figure out what is the definition of diversity? What does inclusion look like? How do we define it? And we're in the academy. How do we operationalize it? We don't just stay in this anecdotal space, right? How do we operationalize it? The evidence is overwhelming. No longer are we in this anecdotal space of trying to bring some sort of validity to this work. There's data to support it now. And you're going to hear a lot about that data, and I'm going to somewhat try again to lay the foundation for the data that's going to support the notion of, are you listening? Because the voices are there. Qualifications are no longer an issue. The rhetoric that I heard earlier in my career, and I'm sure you all did as well, that we're looking, they're not there. They are. We are. You are. But are you listening? So let's unpack this a little bit further. In my mind, and I want to level set before I get to the thesis of my talk today, in my mind, I always say, just as a matter of finding common ground, there are three cases to be made for why equity and inclusion matters on various levels, but specifically from an organizational standpoint, from an academic standpoint, wherever you may find yourself, there is a legal, a moral, and a business case. In many of the conversations that I have had with business leaders, with administrators, with government officials, usually can be deduced to three. The legal case, somewhat self-explanatory. To avoid lawsuit, to avoid the threat of litigation, where we have seen many organizations be somewhat reminded of the importance of equity and inclusion and how it is systemically woven throughout their organizations because some lawsuit told them, you need to care about this. And law, the legal team came and said, well, you need to revisit some of these policies. That you need to understand that your leaders can't talk to your teammates that way. You got to understand that when you are in those hiring interviews, you can't ask that woman if she's planning to have kids. And some of us, we've been a part of that. We've seen that. We've heard those stories. The threat of litigation is a great motivator for many organizations. There is also a moral case, which I don't typically spend a lot of my time trying to compel the morality of business leaders. I do not. Oftentimes, that is a pathway to nowhere, okay? But it has its place, okay? Let's be honest. And my hope is that we can also somewhat rally around the moral case of equity and inclusion and why this work matters, because there are so many voiceless who are depending on our agency and the work that we do in championing their voices. The last piece, and this will be what my conversation rallies around, is the business case for why equity and inclusion and diversity matters. It is just good business sense to show that we are diverse, to show that we care, to show that we're inclusive, to show that we will put pronouns in our newsletters, to show that we build accessibility ramps. And I spent the better part of my career in public relations, so I know that oftentimes when those business cases want to be told, they bring those to me to say, tell everybody the great work we're doing. We don't want to just do it from a pure altruism standpoint. We can't get headlines for that. Our investors want to know that we're doing this work because we're getting a tremendous amount of pressure from outside of these walls to do it. The business case complicates things a bit and can become a bit more problematic, and the reason why we are seeing a lot of what we are seeing outside of these walls. Consider the state of DEI. We've seen the headlines. It is absolutely under attack and being framed in many ways that are making our jobs much more difficult, that's making our passion around championing the voiceless much more difficult. And again, it is not simply from one vantage point. It is not simply political. In the state of Florida, they are going through it, to put it colloquially. Ripped from headlines. You see from Bloomberg Law, corporate diversity pledges fizzle amid layoffs, GOP backlash. Missouri House votes to ban diversity spending in government. And as I'm talking, I want you to also, and it's important to me, and hopefully it will be important to you, is to turn what I'm saying inward. Reflect, all right? By no means is this designed to shame, or by no means will anything that I say be designed to make you feel as though you are othered. Again, this is an affinity group, and as we move through, it is designed for self-reflection that ultimately will lead us to a path of growth and development. That is my goal. And again, please do, as I will do for you, assume positive intent throughout. So if I come down your road figuratively, perhaps that is a point of reflection that needs to be done. Okay? So let me put that out there as well. More to give us an indication, we go back, to give us a bit of an indication as to the state of equity and inclusion. We come back. We see, and this is primarily an area that I want you to understand and focus on, because I had a really interesting conversation with a few folks before I came in here. And oftentimes we will look at the perilous work that is going on and the attacks and the threats to equity and inclusion in other states and across other industries. And we will think to ourselves, it can't come down our road. It can't penetrate the academy. Yes, it can. When government gets involved, when politics become interested in what you are talking about within your private or public spaces, that is a slippery slope. There should not be any false sense of security in any space that we find ourselves in doing this work. Digging into what is taking place in other areas and in other industries and other geographical locations will give you oftentimes an indication as to what may potentially come your way. So this work is of the utmost importance. Also framing the state. I put a few quotes in here. DE&I from a tech leader and I'm coming from Silicon Valley. DE&I always has been an optional line item within corporate America's budgets, while DE&I programs rose after the death of George Floyd, seminal moment that we saw. They will likely become a resource reduction as inflation increases. Another leader of a prestigious law firm, they heard concerns about the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Fast forward 3 years later, that meteoric rise in equity and inclusion work after the death of George Floyd, the data's starting to roll in. The data's starting to roll in as to whether that actually settled, as to whether that actually became a concrete, systemic portion of your strategy or not. This leader said they heard the concerns about the need for DE&I. Fast forward 3 years later, that push isn't that much present in the media every day and prevalent on social media. Since that push isn't that prevalent, they don't feel the pressure to prioritize racial diversity and inclusion. So one professor at the university out in Ohio, OSU, she put it a way that I want to provide sort of a thesis for the balance of time that I have. She said, at its best, the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion can yield transformative organizational outcomes, but at its worst, DEI work can devolve into a series of performative platitudes that erode trust and disappear once public pressure subsides. So I want you to consider the most urgent threat to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my goal for the remainder of the time, it's always three things. I want to give you something to think about, something to feel, and something to do. That is always the marker of a impactful presentation for me. Something to think about, something to feel, something to do. Hold me to that as we move through. Is it racism? We've heard that narrative before as well. Is that the most urgent threat to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is it bigotry? We've heard that narrative in many of the spaces that I operate in. Oftentimes, diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders will sit and commiserate in the room and just flat out get to the point that we are just facing flat out systemic racism and bigotry. And you somewhat find yourself at a defeatist position because those are elements of our society that have been there for centuries. That will not be and have not been undone overnight. Is it apathy? Is that the greatest threat to DEI? Now, while all of these do have their place in being barriers to this work moving forward, I want you to consider the greatest threat in my mind that we continue to see is the performance of DEI. And again, I want you to reflect as I'm having this conversation, as we're having this conversation together, to where potentially you can find places of agency for yourselves even. So you can potentially galvanize and recognize and reflect on your spaces that may or may not touch equity and inclusion work that you know of, but everyone in this room has a role on the team, whether you know it or not. Everyone in this room, whether you are the lead of the team or you're a role player in championing equity and inclusion work. Understanding that the performances that we have seen over and above the other potential threats to this work moving forward, we can see those, right? We can see those. Bigotry, hatred, racism, flat out standing in the way, putting policies in place to preempt the efforts. Many of the headlines that I showed you, you can see those. While they may be daunting, I could somewhat rally around and try to strategize as to how to circumnavigate, to get around those. But the performance of DEI is much more subtle. It provides a built-in excuse. How do you know that the over 300 DEI positions from just a few companies, Nike, Twitter, Amazon, the top, who in the last several months, not years, have laid off over 300 DEI professionals? How do you know if the reasoning why they claim of economic headwinds, as we used to say, in the corporate world? I wrote press releases and memos that we came up with and contrived a narrative to make people feel like what you're seeing isn't what you're seeing. We came up with labels like economic headwinds. And again, last to be hired, first to be fired. And oftentimes they were those equity and inclusion beneficiaries. The performance. What is performative diversity? Again, we're in the academy, so I like to bring definitions, I like to bring data, I like to bring research to support it. Performative diversity is when organizations prioritize the appearance of diversity over meaningful action to address systemic issues that are often deeply rooted in organizational culture and practice. Many of you all have experienced it before, or you've seen it. I certainly have. What is performative diversity? Things like using stock photos in advertising. How many times have you seen it? I literally Googled diversity photos and this stock image came up. This was really the only one that didn't have a watermark on it. There are many of them because it's big business. The performance is big business. The performance doesn't make you have to go and reallocate money from your R&D team and give it to your diversity team. The performance says you don't have to do that. We'll show you. We'll show the public what they want to see. We'll show the public exactly what diversity looks like for our organization. They will have no way of knowing. Anybody seen The Wizard of Oz? They'll have no way of knowing that there's nothing back there. What's back there is not what you think it is. I'm sure I just dated myself, but I'm embracing my older age. The Wizard of Oz. Creating diversity committees without providing them with resources or power. Not just resources, power. I have seen so many, as I call them, toothless lions that have been given teams, but they have no power. The chief diversity officer doesn't sit on the president's cabinet. The chief diversity officer doesn't hold meetings with leaders in corporate spaces. They simply play in their sandbox while the rest of the organization does the important work. Right? Also, hiring for visual diversity. That's another reason why I put this picture. I call it visual diversity. All right? Because as we know, our social identities that make us diverse aren't always visible. We know that, right? We know that. But I can't send out a LinkedIn post with that. I can't put a LinkedIn post out there to tell the world that we value diversity if you can't see it. So I got to go find some people who look diverse, right? There's a risk in that. There's a danger in that. Celebrating things like diverse holidays, using inclusive language in newsletters. I had a client of mine who I assumed their arms were long enough to pat themselves on the back because they were so proud of themselves that they put pronouns in this newsletter and sent it out to their employees. And I said, what else did you do? Well, we sent the pronouns out. I said, well, what else did you do? Well, those pronouns. Performative diversity. What is, again, performative diversity? Things like cosmetic changes. This refers to superficial changes that give the appearance of diversity but do not address underlying issues of inequality and discrimination. Research, again, is coming to our aid. It's not just anecdotal anymore. I don't just have to now say I feel this way. I worked in corporate for so long, and I would see people talk about earlier on, many years ago, talk about equity and inclusion and sit on panels, and they would be part of symposiums that are broadcasted, and they would be interviewed by certain leaders, and they would just give a bunch of anecdotes. Like you're just setting them up to be shot down by those saying, no, this work isn't what you say it is. You have nothing to support it. No, the research is now coming to our aid. For example, an organization may change its logo to include rainbow colors during Pride Month, but not address workplace policies that discriminate against our LGBTQ plus community. But you got the logo, and you can post that on LinkedIn again. For the whole month of Pride, you can change your logo, and for many that will suffice. For many consumers that will suffice. For many potential donors that will suffice. But there's more than meets the eye. The one size fits all approach. This approach assumes that all employees have the same needs, that we're this homogenous group of people, and we have similar experiences regardless of their background. This can lead to a lack of understanding and support for underrepresented groups. I don't have time to tell you the experiences that I have had under this one-size-fits-all approach. And to be fair, oftentimes this one-size-fits-all approach to equity and inclusion came from this one person who was brought over from a different part of HR and said, "You're black, you're a woman, you are openly gay. Can you do this for us?" And they are trying to make magic on their own while they have their day job. That's not diversity and inclusion. I've lived this with many of my colleagues. To this day, I see it. Overworked, underappreciated. So what do when you are resource strapped? You throw a blanket out there. It's almost like if you can't afford multiple pairs of shoes, what do you get? Neutral colors, right? Just go with every outfit. Just go with every outfit. Get white shoes, black shoes, gray shoes. We have seen this one-size-fits-all approach in organizations many times. For example, organizations may offer a universal mentoring program without taking into account the unique challenges faced by women or people of color in the workplace. And I'll preface what I'm about to say again. Nobody works for Apple in here, right? You heard in my bio, I was part of this Thurgood Marshall mentoring program. We brought a ton of what Apple defined as marginalized and disenfranchised students from HBCUs, all right? And we spent millions of dollars, brought them out, paired them with people like me, mentors from different parts of the organization. We provided them housing. We put them in their division of choice, engineering, graphic design, communication, so on and so forth. And many of these individuals, and again, there was nothing nefarious about it. It just shows you the complexity that oftentimes will show the cracks in equity and inclusion work. Many of them came out and felt like they were on an island. Many of them came out, and while the program was designed to reap beneficial ends, it had pure goals and objectives. The journey that these individuals from various backgrounds, geographically as well. If you've ever been to the Bay Area or any part of California, California culturally is kind of its own thing. Well, we brought a bunch of students out from the East Coast and said, assimilate, basically. It wasn't a culture raid. Acculturation allows you to maintain some of your identity. It allows you to maintain much of who you are. Oftentimes, these programs they don't account for the uniqueness and the challenges that are faced that only you fully understand. And many of these, they did not succeed, not because of the aptitude, not because of the want, not because of potential. Many of them, they fell between the cracks because this program that was designed to allow them to be seen was not developed to actually allow them to be seen for who they were, who they are, and what they needed, more specifically. Couple of other examples: lack of accountability. Organizations may claim to value diversity and inclusion, but fail to hold individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior. Again, a policy is limited to your ability and willingness to enforce it. Policies on the books that have no teeth behind them, specifically when it comes to issues of inequity, issues of discrimination, where employees do not feel safe to report incidents of bias or discrimination. I've worked for organizations that are just coming around to having whistleblowing lines that are anonymous. Why did it take us so long? How many people were subjected to discrimination and discriminatory and predatory experiences that just did not have a policy that allowed them to go tell you, to go report it, to go feel safe in your environment, and many of them opted out. Oftentimes, and it's beyond the scope of this conversation, oftentimes the attrition issue within equity and inclusion, retention is one of the largest areas and battlegrounds of DEI. It's retention. And these issues oftentimes are the reason why, because individuals, because of systemic flaws, feel as though they need to suffer in silence. And you're only going to suffer in silence for so long, before eventually you are going to vote with your feet, as we say. You're going to leave. But there are dangers of the performance. Performance is not a victimless offense, I like to say. There are individuals, oftentimes the voiceless, oftentimes those who are at the epicenter of even having symposiums like these to have these discussions. It is not a victimless offense. It impacts both employees and the organization. It provides oftentimes a false sense of progress. There are more examples than I could tell you today of organizations I have worked with that they started to believe the performance eventually. They started to believe that they were making an impact with many of the superficial tactics that they were deploying. And they were wondering why employees were not giving them the feedback that they thought they should receive. That organization that sent out that newsletter that included pronouns, and when their leaders decided that pronouns were too complicated, so we're going to stop using them. It's clearly not embedded into your culture. It's not embedded into the organization. So when you start wondering why that little newsletter did not make a dent, that's why I asked the question, what else did you do? Nothing came behind it. It gives organizations oftentimes a false sense of accountability. It can also lead to what is known as tokenism. And again, tokenism, none of us in this room are immune to it. While tokenism oftentimes is given a face that looks like mine, oftentimes it is given a face that looks like that stock image I put up there. Tokenism occurs when organizations hire or promote individuals from underrepresented groups primarily to appear diverse, rather than for their qualifications or contributions. This can lead to a culture of exclusion, not inclusion, where individuals from underrepresented groups may feel isolated or undervalued. I'll raise the stakes a bit since we're in the academy with a close relative of tokenism that many of you all may relate to: the culture tax. Amado Padilla in 1994 came up with this concept, and it came from the academy. The culture tax is the obligation to show good citizenship towards the institution or employer by serving its need for ethnic representation on committees, or to demonstrate knowledge and commitment to a cultural group which may bring accolades to said institution, but which is not usually rewarded by the institution on whose behalf the service was performed. Specifically in 2020, I felt this heavily. Myself and those people who the public recognized as historically marginalized and disenfranchised, guess who were on the front lines for our organizations, for our institutions? I did so many television interviews in 2020, and I'm no fool. While again, I believe that I bring value to this space as a voice, I fully understood that my institution knew that they couldn't put a cisgender white male to talk about the implications of social unrest following George Floyd's murder and what is our institution doing about it. People like me were put up there. But when it came to credibility given, all was forgotten eventually. I'm a tenure-track professor. When it came down to how do you value all that work that was put in? Now you have to operationalize it. Now you have to show me and people like me that when hashtag Stop Asian Hate was taking place in earnest, guess who were doing all the interviews then? Guess who was out front? When Women's History Month came out, guess who was out there? When we were having issues with trans athletes being discriminated against, not when, we're still. But when that was really robust in the media, guess who they put out there? One of those folks in that stock image. It's your turn now. Go out there. The culture tax was heavy, but the rewards weren't there. The acknowledgement of the work that you do, putting your culture figuratively on your sleeve for the masses to consume, oftentimes simply so we can help you get out of hot water. And oftentimes it makes us feel as though we are an actor in this performance. When we actually believe in the work, when you actually believe in the work, when you actually believe that trans rights are the right thing to champion, when you actually believe that accessibility matters, when you actually believe that the issues that we champion every single day, whether seen or unseen, matter, the culture tax is real. And whether you have experienced the culture tax or potentially, and again, I will always say this and disclaim anything that I say that may sound like an indictment. Oftentimes, many of the issues related to culture tax and related to some of the systemic breakage in organizations from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, they are not malicious at all. Many of them are well-meaning, well-intended. So again, as we reflect, many of us may run afoul. We may have placed the culture tax on others, unknowing that we're not giving the credibility and the rewards of those who are putting themselves on the line, both emotionally and physically. It is quite literally taxing to step out front and discuss these issues, no matter how passionate you are about it. Again, passion doesn't pay the bills. Passion doesn't get you tenured. Passion doesn't get you promoted. Passion doesn't get you that grant you're trying to go after. But of course, when it comes to the dangers of performing in certain economic times, all areas, all departments should re-examine their budgets. However, this can be done equitably. We can leverage data that underscores the impact and outcomes of our DEI initiatives. There is oftentimes damage to organizations' reputation, even when we see that the economy says that you should be laying people off, right? That a lot of folks are being laid off. That's where the performance is so dangerous, because how do you know? Oftentimes, the only way that you know is to look deeper into the data to say who's being laid off. Again, I'll remind you, I'll come back to this. Hopefully, this will be burned into your thinking. Last one hired, first one fired. Oftentimes, that is the indicator to tell us if this actually was what you said it was back in 2020, back in 2019, when we saw so many commitments to diversity statements that came out. Just do a Google search around 2020. Commitment to diversity, you're going to see a ton of them come up. But now we're seeing what actually happens when the performance ends. What happens when the curtain closes? What happens? And oftentimes there's that saying that it's not the impact that kills you, it's the sudden stop. And we're seeing that a lot. It is disproportionately impacting certain groups. These massive layoffs that are taking place in major companies, Amazon, Twitter, Nike, and again, while Twitter may have an asterisk next to it because of recent acquisitions in leadership. It's a different conversation. We can talk about that outside if you want to. Amazon, Nike, these are model organizations that have shed between 5 and 16 DEI professionals each over the last year. And I want you to put it in proper perspective. The median DEI team research shows in companies is 3. Again, I'm no mathematician, but if you're laying off between 5 and 16, you're laying off whole teams. Teams are actually going out the door, not just the analyst or the specialist or some entry-level role. You're losing chief diversity officers. Or like in many of the cases, and I'll stop naming names because at some point you all may have worked for an organization I've worked for, but in many of the organizations that I've worked for, you just changed that person's title back to what it was before. That story about Michelle and an organization, real person, by the way, in the organization that I worked for, who just had a passion for diversity work, who didn't have that title. Eventually, they gave her that title. And guess what happens during layoffs? They don't want to lose Michelle. However, we had to get rid of your whole team, so your title's going to, remember that old title you had? You're going to go back to that. So while many of these folks in this statistic, they didn't leave the organization, the work they were doing did. The hidden performance, the hidden danger of the performance. Because unless Michelle tells you what really happened, you're going to see Michelle still there. Michelle's not gonna put the little avatar on her LinkedIn profile saying open to work. You've seen that before. So if you don't see that, you're gonna think, oh, this company's all good. They're still committed to it. When in actuality, it couldn't be anything contrary to that. So a little bit more data around it. HBR, the Harvard Business Review in 2016, put out a study that showed that when organizations cut positions rather than evaluate individual workers, they end up with an immediate 9 to 22% drop in the proportion of Black and Hispanic women and Black, Hispanic, and Asian men on their management teams. Again, when companies take a last hired, first fired approach to layoffs, they lose nearly 19% of their share of these identity groups in management and 14% of their share specifically of Asian men. Again, it is not a victimless offense. Further data for those who look for data to support their narrative and justify the work that they are doing. Attrition rates for DEI roles have outpaced those of non-DEI roles at more than 600 U.S. companies that laid off workers since not 2010, not 2015. This isn't old data. Again, a lot of what we point back to when performance really started was 2020. Again, the data's coming. Those of you who are looking for data to support your message is coming to your defense. Find it. Revelio Labs put this data point out there since 2020. 600 U.S. companies have laid off more DEI roles than non-DEI roles, and it's not even close. Some key takeaways as I close my time with you. DEI roles are diminishing at a faster pace than non-DEI roles, beginning in 2021 and continuing to accelerate during layoffs in 2022. I had many leaders, when I would have conversations with them around why do you need my help? Why are you calling me to potentially support your work? Oftentimes, that's when the answers got fuzzy. Oftentimes, that's when sort of the ums and ands and the sort of diversion tactics would happen. Because I was trying to zero in on, are you doing this for the right reasons? And I had a definition of the right reasons. And if someone comes to you with those types of questions, have it on the ready what the reasons should be. Be able to justify and defend your work and what you are passionate about. Because you will oftentimes be faced, whether you open your own consultancy like me or not, oftentimes you will be faced and put in positions to where you have to defend what you are passionate about. Swap out DEI for what you are passionate about. And oftentimes you only get one opportunity to nail it, to possibly set the course for influential people to do the right thing. And oftentimes it is to do the right thing on behalf of the voiceless. Again, can you hear my voice? Many times you only get one chance. There have been many times where I have sat with leaders and had one chance. Christine was one of them a long time ago. She simply, obviously understood the value in this work. Many others did not. Many others, it was clear that it was the performance that they were after. Many of them oftentimes even asked me and said, hey, I also heard you did public relations. Can you help us write this statement? I was like, for what? Well, we just kind of need you to help us write this statement to tell people that we care, that we're renewing our commitment to diversity. Well, renewal kind of denotes that you had something before, right? That's usually why I would add, and that's usually when the conversations would end at that point. All right. Accountability matters. Over 300 DEI professionals, I want you to take away from this as well, have left from companies that have experienced recent layoffs, sometimes amounting to the exodus of the entire diversity teams. And lastly, companies with DEI teams tend to have more diverse new hires and higher employee satisfaction. If you are looking for reasons why you can build a case for DEI, I will leave you with many of them. Research shows that diverse teams outperform non-diverse teams in terms of financial performance and innovation. Oftentimes, the further we move away from teams impacting the bottom line, the less important you have. The less you are viewed as critical to the operation. Research is now supporting us. A study by Deloitte, I'm sure many of you have heard them before, that found diverse companies had 2.3 times higher cash flow per employee over a 3-year period. And this isn't coming from Wikipedia either. Deloitte is a credible research firm on this work. Again, moving from anecdotal to research-driven justifications. A study by Glassdoor found 67% of job seekers look for D&I policies when considering job offers. We are moving into a generation of a workforce and a job market who care about this work. This is no longer your grandmother and your grandfather's workforce. They are now looking as a matter of choice. These organizations who are not just putting out statements to say that they are valuing equity and inclusion, but they're actually looking to see if they're doing the work. Many of them are sitting in your classrooms. Many of them sit in my classrooms. Many of them walk this campus, who move into the job market, and it's not just pay anymore. It's not just compensation like when I was coming around. How much are you paying? It's expensive to live where. Now, I want to know, what are your maternity leave policies? What are your paternity leave policies? I remember when I had my first child, I asked about paternity leave, and they looked at me like I had 3 heads. They said, did you have the baby? True story, by the way. True story. It's a different conversation. All right. Also, the last few, it also improves employee satisfaction and retention. A diverse and inclusive workplace can lead to improved employee satisfaction and retention. And again, one of the key battlegrounds for equity and inclusion is retention. And here, as a matter of organizational practice, and you don't have to work in HR to know this, it is expensive to rehire when somebody leaves. So again, whether the legal case moves you or the moral case, if they don't move you, as a matter of business principle, equity and inclusion is one of the greatest indicators of retention. We mentioned sense of belonging. That's all a part of it. When organizations leave, or when employees leave your organization, there is a $sign that is attached to every employee. I've seen it. I don't mean that figuratively. It literally, an employee has $sign value. And when they leave, that is oftentimes why equity and inclusion work is given credibility, because you can attach it to the bottom line. And my parting words to you: equity and inclusion It is, whether you believe it or not, it is in fact a matter of social justice. And I've asked you to reflect during this entire presentation. Hopefully you took me up on that. And if you didn't, hopefully you will play back the recording when it's distributed to you, and you will use that as an opportunity to reflect. Those that I have an opportunity to speak with, I always ask them to think about where you are on what is called this action continuum. Are you actively participating in actions against inclusion, diversity, thus social justice? Or are you actively participating in actions that promote? That's why I said everyone in this room, whether you have the job title or not, you have a role on the team to push this work forward or set it back. Are you actively participating? Are you denying that it even exists? Are you recognizing that there's an issue and then take no action? Do you get the warm and fuzzies when you're in this room with like-minded individuals and then you walk out and nothing happens? That is also a role many play. Or do you move to the right side of this continuum and, dare I say, the right side of this work? And do you start educating yourself and others about this work? Do you start supporting actively? And it's a great first step that you're here, if this is the first step for some of you. But do you start preparing yourself to be an agent of change and support for this important work? And then do you start to move to change policies, to change procedures, to possibly call out certain issues that you are seeing in your workplace? Wherever you are on that spectrum, I ask that you reflect and operate and act accordingly. But if you have not moved to that point of self-reflection and discovery, I was told one time by a leader when I was struggling to find my place in corporate America. I saw no one who looked like me. I saw no one who was from a similar cultural background as me. I did not understand their jokes. I did not understand their colloquialisms. But everybody else was basking in familiarity except me. And I had a leader who just gave me some very profound words. And she said, "Shaun, just show up." She said, "Just show up." The first step to changing things is to show up. Continue to do the work while you are equipping yourself and arming yourself to be an agent of change, to be able to step in places that need you so desperately. Until you get to that point, just show up. Because this work of equity and inclusion, oftentimes it feels like a minefield. And this image up here, I show it a lot because it is very sobering. This is an image of a group who are sweeping an active minefield. And it's not so much the danger of the work that I am trying to call to your attention, although it is becoming increasingly dangerous to do this work, especially in a very socio-political environment we find ourselves in. But more importantly, I want to call your attention to the selflessness of these individuals to clear the path for those coming behind them, to not defer their responsibility to someone else to do it, to take the responsibility to do the work in such a way to where those who are traversing this path that we have already uniformly acknowledged is challenging work, to remove some of those obstacles, fully understanding that navigating this space of DEI and taking some of these issues to many individuals who really take an apathetic, ambivalent stance on it at any time could blow up in your face, causing job loss, causing reputation damage. We live in a social capital world, causing you to lose social and political capital in these spaces that you've worked so desperately hard to gain. Poof, could blow up in your faces. Still do the work. Because it is so important to understand that while we talk about, can you hear my voice? Always keep in mind that someone somewhere is counting on us to do the work. But conversely, someone somewhere is also counting on us to do nothing at all. So when the question comes up, can you hear my voice? Counter that with, are you listening? And listen for the answer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone can hear me in the back? Okay. Well, thank you for being here. This is our last panel, our last session of this symposium, and this has been an amazing day. Wouldn't you agree? Yes. So we have our panelists here. I think we have had a chance to meet and hear from everyone, so I'm not going to reread bios, but we do have one panelist who we've not had an opportunity to meet, and that's Patricia. So Patricia, I'd like to give you a few minutes just to introduce yourself.
Can you hear me? Yep. So my name is Patricia Fernandez de Castro. I am the president of the Latino Civic Association of Tompkins County. I also am staff here at Cornell. I work at the Department of Astronomy. And I've been at Cornell in Ithaca for 22 years. I was born and grew up in Mexico. I went to college in Mexico. Then for graduate school, I went to Austin and the University of Chicago, and then I went back to Mexico to work. And while I was, my professional interest was popular resistance and movements of revolt and resistance in northern Mexico. So I worked on the border for a number of years, and I got to see the reality of international migration there and of undocumented migration. And when I got here to Ithaca, I remember my husband, who had been living here in Ithaca for a long time, took me around to see the colors. It was the fall, and he went around showing me how beautiful the countryside was. And what I was surprised to see, what shocked me the most, was the amount of rural poverty. Where he was seeing beautiful colors, I realized there were a lot, and I started wondering, are there undocumented migrants here? We bought a house in Genoa, which is about 25 minutes from here, and there was an IGA store, a small general store. And I remember walking in there the first one of our, when we were just moved in, looking for milk. And there was a whole shelf of harina de maíz nixtamalizado. And I knew that I was living in a place where there were a lot of undocumented migrant workers, which there are, in fact, in pretty much every single dairy farm and many of the other agricultural farms around here are run on undocumented labor. And that's sort of how I got to know this area, and that's how I got involved then with the Latino Civic Association, partly also because I felt the need for a cultural home. At the time, Cornell was even less diverse than it is now, and I really felt a desire to hang out with people who were like me and who spoke Spanish and who enjoyed the same kind of food I do. And so now, 22 years later, I'm very involved in working with undocumented migrants in this area, and actually all the way to Monroe and Wayne County. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Donna, for inviting me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Patricia. That is a great segue into my first question. I don't think any of us, after we graduated from college, said I'm going into DEI. We just kind of found our way into these positions. So I'd like to hear from each of you what led you to this space. And we'll start to my right with Dr. Fletcher.
I will say, can you all hear me? Is my mic on? You guys got it? All right, fantastic. For me, what was sort of an impetus for me, and you're absolutely correct, I did not graduate and say, this is gonna be my lane at all. And I think many practitioners in this space share a similar experience. For me, sort of I guess a culmination of factors of lived experience and realizing that if not me, then whom? No one was coming to rescue me. The feelings of tokenism and isolation and imposter syndrome and feeling as though you are forced to assimilate in certain environments and you are not actually seen. When those came to a head and I realized in those spaces that I don't want to leave, it's not me. I'm not the problem. It is the environment that I operate in that is not inclusive and inviting me to be my authentic self. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, when I saw that now I see a problem, and then I see the very few people who are being positioned and equipped to do anything about it, they were in need of support and help to do it. So again, I'm a firm believer that neutrality in this space isn't an option. You're either sitting there admiring the problem or you're doing something about it. So I want to be part of the solution.
Wonderful, thank you. Patricia?
Well, I think I already said a little bit about how I got into this. There was a prior lived experience, family experience. My grandmother was a sweatshop worker. She was she did not finish third grade. She started working when she was 13 years old. And she worked her entire life, and she was poor her entire life. My parents were educated, but we were barely middle class. There were times when my mother had to make bread because she couldn't afford to buy bread. So I grew up very aware of what the meaning of poverty was. My dad worked with in the countryside in Mexico at the time when public health was being established, and sometimes he would take us to visit his patients who were lepers. And rural poverty is very hard, but we learned to respect people and to see that neither poverty nor disease are something to be afraid of, but something that is human. It's part of our human nature.
Hello again. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. I think that you heard my bio this morning. I worked in a lot of different disability arenas, and every one of them has given me sort of a different view of what it's like to be trying to live and work and go to school as an individual with disability in an area similar to what Dr. Fletcher said, where the world really wasn't designed for you. It wasn't designed for that, and sort of coming to that realization on my own first as a person. I came to that realization, well, wait a minute, maybe I'm not the problem here. I'm already killing myself to do what I have to do to fit in. What about everybody around me? What are they doing to help me fit in? And so that's the kind of stuff that has really driven my desire to elevate, us talking about individuals with disabilities. At the same time, though, the longer I worked, the older I get, I also was realizing where I have privilege as well. And I heard somebody recently say something very profound, which is you really don't have a right to be talking about where you don't have privilege until you start talking about where you do have privilege. And so simultaneously, as I'm going through my own journey, I'm also learning about white privilege and heterosexual privilege, which are privileges that I have. And so, and I couldn't deny them because I knew what it was like to not have privilege when it comes to both gender and also disability status. So I just say that to say that I think those two worlds and identities have collided into making me want to do this work to elevate not just for people with disabilities, but for everybody. All the populations we heard about today, and every other population.
Aaron.
I came to, excuse me, to commitment to addressing DEI matters and a commitment of sorts through a series of experiences. It really began when I went to Colgate Rochester Coast Divinity School in Rochester. And I had come out of an experience growing up in Black Baptist churches. And that was pretty much the world I knew. I mean, I knew there were other churches from other denominations, but I found myself in a divinity school where there were people from 22 different denominations. And so there was a diversity in and of itself, which helped me to become ecumenical. But in reading while in school and continuing this even to this day, being informed by the life and legacy of Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman, both of whom were graduates of the Divinity School, and who were strong advocates for faith-based social justice, but not in a narrow sectarian sense. They understood their faith opening them up to a broader world beyond one's own Christian tradition. And their emphasis on community was what helped them to really fashion a broad spectrum, multi-faith approach to social justice. Thurman lays this out in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Dr. King really built the most important multi-faith as well as multi-racial movement for social justice of the 20th century. Though, when I went to San Francisco to work at Third Baptist Church, historic Black Baptist Church, which had a refugee resettlement project for Ethiopians who were fleeing a brutal and harsh regime there in the 1980s, I became all the more sensitized to these factors. The reading and listening to their stories of the horrors that they escaped impacted me profoundly. But also, too, the church joined with Temple Emmanuel, the largest Reformed Jewish temple in Northern California, to start an after-school tutorial program in the Fillmore district of San Francisco, where the church is located. And so I saw this sort of interfaith sort of piece. And now that after-school program is now celebrating its 35th year. And so from there, I go to Penn State, and then it's right at the advent, the beginning of DEI work in higher education. So I fall right into that, but I had been prepared by my education and by my experiences to really get right into this. And that's really, as I explained earlier, this is part of what made me come alive.
Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Tanya, can you call on me first next time?
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
This is unbelievable. Dr. Fletcher showed a few photos of performative DE&I images, and I kind of look like all the people in those photos. I grew up in an incredibly privileged position in the Midwest. I had a stable family. I had access to education. I had a supportive network around me and means to support my educational pursuits. And I guess what I'm most grateful for is the gift of awareness. And I knew, thankfully from an early age, that there were inequities around me and there was an imbalance, and that I was incredibly lucky. And I don't know where that came from. I think from my grandma probably, but Ultimately, I knew really early on that to use the gifts to better myself or use those opportunities to improve my own life wouldn't be as meaningful. And I quickly found that advocating for others, for being a part of a coalition, working for a cause, gave me great fulfillment. And to fast forward my experience in the criminal legal system, ultimately I was really just dissatisfied with the outcomes that we were producing. And I really wanted to use my law degree to help people directly. And Cornell's given me that opportunity, and the work that we're doing has really been fulfilling a long mission and journey to sort of what Dr. Clark said in your speech about finding a project, and that's where I'm at now. So thank you.
Yeah. So Tim and I are both from Missouri. He's from St. Louis, so he's considered Midwestern. I'm from Southeast Missouri, so I'm actually Southern. So
We're big city folk in St. Louis.
Hey, I'm from St. Louis too.
yeah, oh, yes.
Small world.
Yes. So in May 2020, following the death of George Floyd, we saw a shift in how people reacted to his death versus previous deaths at the hand of law enforcement. Individuals and organizations who had previously been politically active were suddenly pushing for organizations to reevaluate the various types of normalized institutional biases and discriminatory practices that were baked into their policies and procedures. We saw companies, organizations, and educational institutions issuing statements of support, moving firmly into the social justice space. Many organizations were hiring their first chief diversity officers, requiring diversity trainings, and creating strategic diversity plans. Here we are, just a few months from the 3-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. Feels like we've come back to where we were before May 2020. And by that, I mean things have slowed down. We've heard from Dr. Fletcher that people in DEI positions have been laid off. Nothing else is really as urgent as it was prior to the death of George Floyd. We feel like we've come back to the status quo. Many people stopped caring once we moved far away enough from the incident and were able to go back to where we were before. Today we heard that our DEI initiatives such as this conference, how impactful these types of programs can be in the process of beginning to create change within an organization. And we need people, the right people, to care. DEI is frequently called heart work. Can we continue to do this work effectively, just counting on our ability to change people's hearts? Or until the next tragedy happens? And we'll start with anyone who would like to comment.
Tim?
I did ask to be called on first.
I called your bluff.
Dr. Fletcher, a fellow St. Louisan, to just throw me under the bus. The answer is yes and no. I don't know. No. I do think it starts with heart. I do think you have to change minds. But one takeaway I have from this conference too is action is necessary. Tools. We need tools. We need legislation. We need votes. We need people in power to make decisions, and those people in power to have financial support to do it. So I think it's really action and tangible, demonstrable movement towards our objectives that are clear, that we articulate, that we're persistent about. And a lot of what the thoughts and prayers thing is sort of in the rearview mirror, and we're really, as Marshawn Lynch said, about that action, right? I think he was like, all right, who's that? Do I get Dr. Fletcher? Now let me return the favor. Let me return the flavor.
Turnabout is fair play. I would say reframing it on a number of different levels. How we talk about it and how we talk about anything is extremely important in terms of how it will be received, in terms of the seriousness that we want people to take. It's almost like when people talk about hard skills and soft skills. Well, I view soft skills as essential, but framing it as a soft skill, we will typically give it a sort of stigma. All right, very similar to when we talk about hard work. All right, oftentimes it's a labor of love. We don't usually put money around and investments around labor of love. We just say you'd volunteer for it, wouldn't you? It's work you would do for free. No, it's not. It's not. It's not at all. I would say to that end, and we've seen the data support this as well, when organizations weave in DEI into their KPIs, into their metrics, where you will be measured during your performance reviews. And that's a concerted effort. Okay, it isn't haphazard, it isn't anecdotal or anything like that. The same way that you have your KPIs, that you and your leadership sit down on all different levels, will sit down and say, did you hit this? Did you hit that? Did you fall short on this? How? And you operationalize it. That's why metrics and DEI is so important. It shifts it from being anecdotal to now we can sink our teeth in it. And I'm pointing to it because I said it earlier. But you can sink your teeth into metrics. You can't sink your teeth into, we had a symposium and we had a great time. Okay, well, should I invest in that next year? How? What's going to tell me? What's our return on investment? When we talk about organizations going to the bottom line to show where their priorities are, as the whole panel has talked about throughout the day, well, organizations now speak that language. So when you weave DEI into that, to where and I'm sure you all do this on your campus, we do it on mine as well, where we have belonging surveys and we have cultural assessments and things like that. Now, while there's not an over attribution to that in terms of measuring success of those tasked with that, it's a part of our chief diversity officer's mandate. It's a part of, when you move into other organizations, our HR, and depending on how the organization is structured, when I've seen it work best is when there are hard and fast metrics attached to it that you cannot get around. You have to talk about that and speak to those the same way that you speak to your deliverables in any other job, whether it's sales, research and development, or anything else. You need to be able to talk about belonging. You need to be able to operationalize and concretize these tend to be abstract DEI notions. Let's operationalize those and work those into KPIs to where now they have the same or similar amount of credence and degree of severity as everything else that we have grown to take as serious. Sorry for the long answer.
It's interesting to see that the backlash against DEI is really being codified. It's a part of legislation. People who are looking to kind of move things away from this, diversity and inclusive area are really making sure that it's not going to be easy to go back. I mean, with the legislation that we see in places like Florida and Missouri. So, in her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander stated, "The more things change, the more they remain the same." She went on to state that in each generation, new tactics have been used for achieving the same goals: racial exclusion and discrimination in various forms. We have an extraordinary number of Black and brown people who have gone through the criminal justice system who are now legally barred from voting, who are now subject to legalized discrimination in employment, housing, education, public benefits, and the ability to serve on a jury, as many or more that were excluded from these processes during Jim Crow. What are the steps employers can take when our current hiring practices may be contributing to these inequities? Open to any member of the panel.
I would say see Tim's presentation. That's what I would say. I don't want to use that joke again. We already got a laugh on it, so I won't send it to you. But in all seriousness, a lot of what Tim mentioned in his presentation. It's part and parcel to this question. When you start talking about policy and legality and many of the different aspects that we're seeing that are serving as legalized discrimination, as you mentioned, talking about reform, talking about the penal system and trying to be reintroduced into the workforce and the barriers that we continue to see across the board. Again, I think his presentation hit the nail on the head. So again, while I'm not putting it back on you, I would say see his presentation.
And I just think that to have a criminal record is you know, it's been called a scarlet letter. It's with you for the rest of your life. And I could have shown another 30 slides showing all the negative impacts, not just for employment, but housing, as you mentioned, advancement. But as society, we expect to remove somebody from their community, put them in an inhumane cage for a number of years, not able to access education or training for a lot of years, although college education is coming back, to release and say, okay, now become a productive member of society and get a job. And we haven't prepared that individual. And I think, too, our public discourse is obsessed with crime, obsessed with, you know, what could be called the Willie Horton effect, where we take one isolated incident, one crime, and then try to legislate around that kind of horrific act, as opposed to looking at it as a really complex problem where we're not investing at all in rehabilitation or in the community or in reentry, but we're putting all of our money in incarceration and police and the criminal legal system. But all to say the public discourse currently right now is public safety or criminal justice reform. Those are your options. To me, the answer is both. You can have criminal justice reform. You can have public safety. These can be done together. It's a false dichotomy. But to move away from the criminal justice and back into employment, I think, again, to try to open up some of these barriers. There's so many barriers to occupational licensing if you have a criminal record. Our own internal HR policies, and asking ourselves, what are we doing to ensure that every candidate has an opportunity for economic advancement? And just to reiterate that point is like what gets lost in that public safety versus criminal justice reform is access to economic advancement. That gets lost. What about, where's that discussion? I feel like both sides can get behind that. Both sides can say, wait, I think providing economic opportunity is good. It's good for the family, it's good for the individual, it's good for society. Productive citizens, employment is one of the number one indicators of recidivism. Why aren't we talking about what we can agree on more? Because I guess it's not as interesting as the argument and the debate that we hear in 140 characters.
I would just somewhat, from a socio-political standpoint, specifically living in a capitalistic society, we have seen to where politics and those who drive many of these policies that you just mentioned, Sonia, that continue to really operate as legalized discrimination, stripping of voting rights, stripping you of your civil liberties that allow for you to exercise your opinions, your true authentic self to show up. We have seen many, many times to where, again, specifically in a capitalistic society, other societies and systems of governance notwithstanding, to where on many of these boards, we see politicians, and many of those who give funds, we see corporate executives. They have influence, is my point. We have seen Tim Cook on Capitol Hill speaking before congressional committees to lobby for what he chooses to lobby for. He has lobbied for LGBTQ plus rights. He has lobbied just alongside, similarly to how he has lobbied for privacy acts and things of that also align with his business goal. He's towed the line of socio-political statements and social justice statements and his business interests. And we have seen that he and others have made, Bob Iger has done the same thing with Disney. When they want to wield that influence to impact policy, they do it. We've seen that in California where I live. Many of the tech elite hold court with Governor Newsom. They go to the state capitol and lobby. So when they want to, they can. And there's access and an avenue to influencing policy. So I would say there is obviously everything that was mentioned in terms of what we can do at our level is spot on. But I would say understanding the way that our political and corporate system works, to zoom out and really take a look at the commingling that takes place and the cross-pollination of influence, and one influences the other to make change from a corporate standpoint, and then from a policy standpoint, I think there's also a higher level of opportunity that's there as well to see some of these change. And we see that all the time. Politicians are absolutely swayed by the corporate elite and vice versa.
Tim, can you talk to us a little bit more about the Yang Tan Workability Incubator?
Thank you, Sonia. So the Restorative Record Project is benefited from support from the Yang Tan Workability Incubator. The purpose really is to find innovative ideas on campus and to support them and to try to make changes in the field. So often, I work with colleagues and we have really important research studies, papers being published, which is necessary. It informs a lot of my work actually in terms of best practices. But in the outreach division at ILR, where I'm located, we're judged by our impact and what we're doing for the populations we serve. And the Center for Applied Research on Work was formed to sort of harness that and make the connection between the research that's done and the field work, to marry those two things to really create the best possible product. But it really can't be, we can't tout it until it's in the field and we get feedback and we try to make it work. And because of that system, it's allowed this Restorative Record Project to really begin to, it's really in its early stages, but we're in a great position to potentially move the needle. Although initially focused for justice impacted workers, I think the vision is if we can rethink how we hire for maybe the most challenging group in some respects, not to compete, the criminal record faces another layer. Maybe we can have some success in other areas and for other non-traditional workers. And really, when I think about just in my anecdotally work career, I've worked with, and I'm sure a lot of our panelists too, have worked with people with a golden resume who have this exceptional academic credentials and work history. But then you really partner with somebody who's has sort of the characteristics of resilience and persistence and has their project that they've been working on. And that tends to go quite far and be very impactful to move the needle and make a change in the issues we've been talking about today. And those things aren't always captured in our hiring process. So all to say, even though what I presented earlier is very narrowly focused on reducing the negative impact on a criminal record, the hope is we can start to transform our thinking around the hiring process, and the Yang Tan Workability Incubators has empowered us to do that.
Thank you. So let's switch gears a little bit. What are the most important issues, or what do you think, Aaron Simber-Chase, this is for you, are the most important issues facing people with disabilities?
I'm really going to try not to be redundant of some of the things I said this morning, but I think that in general, it was interesting to be a member of the audience today too, it's just to give you an idea of what it's like for somebody who has a disability and who cares a lot about this, to be in the audience at a DEI conference and essentially always have your fingers crossed that the other people speaking are also going to include disability when they talk about the right? And it's like, oh, good, Dr. Fletcher did include accessibility when he rattled off, and oh, good, Robert Clark did say, and people with disabilities, and I don't mean to be flippant, but it's very real that it's so often that doesn't happen, even in this space, where we're talking, where I know I'm surrounded by like-minded people who really care about these issues. Sometimes even in this space, we're not included. So I say that to say that, what are the most pressing issues? That, the fact that you had the stock photo, and I was like, yes, a woman in a wheelchair in a stock photo. It's like, really, it's like, I completely agree with the prevailing themes today about how we have to move beyond appearance and beyond performative. But when it comes to disability, we're not even part of the performative yet across the board. We're not even part of the appearance yet. So it's like, first we have to do that, and then maybe we can finally get to where action is happening. I would rather see us get to action and do stuff, but I recognize that we have to recognize that we're not, always caring and including in the same way. And I think that that's a big issue, first and foremost. When I think about it from an organizational standpoint, it's years of things like trying to point out these inequities, trying to point out, that disability is not included, years of knowing that our employees with disabilities, again, no matter what research you look at across the country, but including right in our own backyard, where they're looking at the research that's telling us that employees with disabilities are not having positive experiences at work, they're not having that sense of belonging, they're not having the inclusion. At some point, we have to stop acknowledging, yeah, we know that that's happening, and actually start to do something to address it. People with disabilities are already doing a lot of work. We do a lot of work just to, as I said this morning, just to be able to leave the house, conduct business, do what we need to do, go to work. We're bending and twisting and conforming every which way in order to do that. At some point, you got to meet us in the middle and it's up to the environment to do some of that conforming and that twisting and that adapting. Otherwise, we're never going to really be included, and we're never going to really be living up to the DEI values that we're all sitting here espousing until we do that.
Aaron. So I think, your response kind of goes along with this next question. When we think about how we represent ourselves as a diverse and inclusive workforce, we sometimes struggle with wanting participation from the employees who are the marginalized groups of the workforce, and to make sure we're always trying to make sure our voices are being heard, they have an opportunity to share their experiences in the right spaces in front of the right people. However, that can lead to a lot of fatigue, what we call diversity fatigue, where you're on every diversity committee, attending every meeting, speaking constantly about our experiences, and making sure that our voices are being heard can sometimes create this exhausting experience for some of us, especially where, when we're in universities where the representation is not always seen in every single department, every single meeting. So how do we avoid creating this diversity fatigue, or how do we not have the people who are marginalized do all the work to see the change that they want to see? Patricia.
So I think one very important thing, well, to start with, we would want to be more of us. There should be more of us as a number and representative of the numbers we are in the population. But very importantly, I think institutions need to recognize the value of this work. They need to it is our passion, our individual passions, but it is work for the institutions. We are doing something for the institution that will enrich the institution, improve the institution. Otherwise, it becomes the cultural tax that Professor Sheldon was talking about. It's a tax that only some people are able to pay. To go without pay for a day to attend this conference is, depends on what your situation is like. Not everyone can do it. How many children you have, or do you have a supportive partner? Or maybe you're single. Not everyone can do it. Also, there's got to be, in order to bring more people in, there's got to be opportunities for mentoring and training to do this kind of work. All of us here have learned sort of in the course of our experience, but we would all benefit from being mentored. We were all, just as being here has been a learning experience. This kind of opportunities are truly very helpful to prevent that fatigue. Also, being here in a group of people that are working on the same, that feeds our spirit, that feeds our passion, because we know we're not alone. Another very important thing, we need to see the effectiveness of the work we're doing. We need to be able to see that there is a change. There's a change, that there's an upward mobility, and that that those opportunities are there for people that are at the bottom level of the ladder, in the middle, and at the top, that we are affecting change at all levels. We need to be seen. In preparation for this conference, I looked at the dashboard, at the diversity dashboard that Cornell has, and I had looked at it in previous years, and I was very surprised to see that now the statistics, as they are published, do not any longer. Well, first of all, there used to be, about 10 years ago, a statistic that showed promotions and retention for faculty. I've never seen that for staff. The statistics don't show, how are we doing with retention and promotions for staff. We also, 10 years ago, the statistics used to break down the different minoritized population into individual groups: Blacks, Latinos, Asians, Indigenous Americans, Native Hawaiians. Everyone was identified. Now it's all one group. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but in the dashboard we're 9%. Minoritized populations are 9%, but I don't know how many of those 9% are Latinos. Is that 9%, does that include a representative percentage of the 6% that Latinos are in Tompkins County? I have no idea, because we are no longer seen. We no longer exist as an individual group. I also think it would be really important for Cornell to recognize that it has its roots in this community. It's a great global university, but its roots are in Tompkins County. And recognizing that and seeing it reach out to the minoritized populations of Tompkins County would be incredibly rewarding for us. Sometimes, again, it seems, how can they hear us if they don't see us, or they see us only performatively? So I think those would be some of the things that I would say, and they would go a long way into transforming that fatigue and skepticism.
As structural changes that have to be made that, again, bridge the gap between the espoused philosophy and the organization and the operational philosophy of these organizations. Excuse me. Structure relationships. And there's got to be structural change that has to address that. I think too, to the extent possible, when we experience diversity fatigue, it's important to own it for what it is. That it's there. It's not just this phantom that kind of comes and goes and not a figment of the imagination. It's real. And so I think to the extent one can do it, one has to kind of carve out moments to step back. How to do that, I think you have to sort of look at your own set of circumstances to see how can you do this in order, how can you step back in order to step back in. And so I think things of that sort are sort of steps, incomplete steps to addressing this issue, but at least initial steps to really, one, recognize that these issues in many ways are beyond our capacity to fix in absolute sense, based on what we're structured in these organizations. And at the same time, you have to do something in the interim to help to basically for yourself, for your own self-preservation. What that looks like, how you do that, you determine according to your context and your circumstances.
I would add just a little bit to that from both sides of it, from a self-preservation standpoint, but then also potentially working within the system and wielding your minority status. And I mean from a numerical standpoint, not a historically recognized minority group. One, just from my personal experience, what saved me from myself was, one, to recognize that I am not the savior for all those who identify with all my different identities, ones you can see and ones you can't. And I had to realize that what I was doing when I would raise my hand for everything, diversity, I was raising my hand, anything. I didn't even let them finish the sentence. I was raising my hand. I was, in many instances, and I learned this specifically in the corporate world, but some remnants of it also bled into my academic life as well, was I realized that by doing that, I was losing a lot of my power and becoming sort of a co-conspirator in my own subjugation to an extent. Because what gives the motivation to not have you isolated if I'm always raising my hand? Shaun will do it. Shaun will do it. Shaun will do it. So I'm not giving very much of a motivation for the powers that be to help me help the situation. I had to turn it, and I give a lot of advice to folks who are dealing with a lot of the fatigue, is locus of control. And that also is part of mental wellness as well, is that there are environmental factors that you cannot control, and we've well documented the DEI flaws and environmental factors. But what can I control? What can Shaun control? I can control my impulses to want to go and be the voice of every identity that I have. I can go and stress myself to no end without really taking into consideration that the environmental factors that I am trying to chip away at, and my peers on this panel are trying to chip away at, is long term. That is a long term. No certificate of completion will ever be given. It is just a longitudinal challenge that we face. So I had to realize that at a certain point, I need to look at myself for my own well-being and my own self-preservation, to take a step back. But then from an organizational standpoint as well, I think we also have to, as we do with any other concept that we're introducing, or it's really not understood enough, we have to further define it. Because oftentimes we raise our hands for the visual diversity roles again. All right. And oftentimes diversity is around us. We just get called because many within our organizations define diversity from a visual standpoint. And it's almost like my Marvel Avengers fans. It's almost like the collection of the Infinity Stones. If they could find a woman of color who has a disability, who is openly gay, it's like Thanos has collected the Infinity Stones and snap your finger. And I lost some of you, but I got most of you. And you'll look up and that's the person that they constantly use in front of everything. They're on the signage, they're on everything. And you're like, wow, this person checked all the boxes. Well, again, how are we defining it? If we really lean into the definitions of diversity, the seen and unseen aspects and social identifiers, and we start educating our employers and our leaders to say, hey, listen, let's move away from these visual diversity markers and prompts that you so easily gravitate towards, that you have now created an appetite of the consuming public to say diversity has to have a look to it, and start educating and re-educating and learning and unlearning some things about what diversity is. It will also help us to not have to say, hey, listen, I checked enough of those boxes. Shaun, you're going to be the black person on this committee. Because unequivocally, they're going to say, we support diversity because you look like it, right? I think we also have to help ourselves while we're helping this broader issue that is the systemic barriers that we're still facing across different industries, whether it's the academy, whether it is the corporate world, nonprofit world still deals with it too, and a number of different spaces that we find ourselves in. So I think it's a push and a pull, but control what you can control, which is yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing? I'm sorry. I'm getting really excited. I just also wanted to bring up the point of, for me, speaking for myself, being clear about what's actually causing the fatigue. What's causing it isn't always that I'm always asked, it's that I'm always asked the same questions and I'm always giving the same answers, and yet nothing's moving forward. The fatigue comes in that we're just having the same conversations and we're pointing out the same problems, but yet we're not actually talking together about solutions, and progress. I get energized by that. I get energized by knowing we're moving forward and that, others around me care about this as much as I do. That energizes me. So I'm not going to get tired. I'm not going to get the same level of fatigue if we're actually moving somewhere. Otherwise, it's just like you're on a stationary bike, and you just keep spinning around. And yeah, that's exercise, but it's pretty boring, and you're not actually doing anywhere, right? It's like, let's move over to a bike that's actually going to move us, forward and see something new and something different and see a sign of progress.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay. Yes. You don't have to rush.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. First of all, thank you so much, all of you, all of our panelists. I feel like what we need to hear so much about is practical ways to get at these issues, and I feel like all of you have done such a great job really providing practical solutions and practical ideas, so thank you so much. Can you speak to the challenges of trying to be inclusive at an exclusive institution? So this is an institution that prides itself on being exclusive, the golden resume, doing phenomenal work with very few resources, don't take time off, answer your email at all hours. I will shout out Donna Lynch Cunningham. She's been really good about encouraging us in arts and sciences not to do those things, but it is part of the culture here. So we're trying to promote mentorship, we're trying to promote mental health, we're trying to promote inclusion, and we work at one of the toughest Ivy Leagues that we have in this country that breaks people's spirits as a matter of course. And we see that in staff, faculty, and students every single day. Can you please speak to those challenges?
I could share one example. Thank you for the question. I'm staying at the Statler Hotel, and from what I'm told, Cornell is elite and egalitarian. So I was informed of that. But I do have a specific example that I think worked and it was helpful, is that if the diversity we seek or the credible messenger or people with lived experiences don't exist, we have to bring them into our community and sometimes go outside. And I had, and I don't think I'm betraying any trust, when my deputy, my right hand, He is formerly incarcerated for 10 years, doesn't have, although he is a Stanford graduate as well. And so, but just building a network and a coalition and allies across the school and even outside of my individual school, say, hey, look what this young man's doing. Brought him onto campus and he spoke, and it created ripples of excitement. And then the next thing, our dean is actively recruiting him to join the initiative. And all to say, this was one example of sometimes if we don't see it right around us through our networks, through creating allyships and coalitions, and there are resources here, and they are available to use. Now, how they get allocated is, I do think, a matter of advocacy and persistence and forming the coalition. And sometimes we find our partners in the most unlikely places too. I find when I go teach in prison, for example, and somebody finds out that I'm a former prosecutor, it's not exactly the relationship, and I have to apologize when I walk in, and I don't make light of it. It's like, if anybody recognizes me, it's uncomfortable. But the reality is, I get so inspired from these interactions that actually inform the work that we do, and if I can harness that and bring it together in, like I said, the most unlikely places, that's sometimes the strongest missions, the strongest projects are exactly what we learned today, which is formed of diverse group of individuals. So find it, it's out there, and we have resources to bring it in if it's not right in front of you.
I would just chime in just a tad bit, and I was having this conversation a little bit earlier, actually, with you. There is, and this is particularly important in the academy, when you talk about influence, it sounds kind of meta, but there has to be representation. We've been talking about representation this whole time and advocacy. Who's advocating for this issue? Where'd you go? Who's advocating for this body of work? And on what levels are they advocating for them? And when you look at spaces like the president's cabinet, that'll tell you where the value or the perceived value across the institution, across a corporation. You look at the president's direct reports. That's going to tell you their division is who's valued. On our campus, our chief diversity officer sits in the president's cabinet. Just like on certain campuses, major sport campuses, head football coaches sit in the president's cabinet. Tells you where their value is placed, right? And also those who don't sit on the cabinet, it also speaks a little bit about them as well, for those of us on the outside looking in, of what value you may not hold relative to others. Now, how that happens, the gritty details of it is a different conversation. However, I think it starts with there needs to be representation of exactly what you're talking about, of inclusivity from a codified standpoint. And symposiums like this is a great start. But when you look and say, okay, who is the sponsor of this? And where are they positioned within the organization or the institution, what have you? Power recognizes that, all right? Everything else flows from it. I learned this in the corporate space as well. Power recognizes power and access to power. Everything else is, as we talked about, hard work. It's a nice to have. Great job, Donna. Great job, team. You put all this together. Don't you feel good about it? Didn't everybody feel good about it? But power recognizes power. If you go over and talk with the provost, that's a different conversation. That's not hard work. The provost is viewed differently on every campus. It's not viewed as hard work. It never is categorized that way. The same edict that is perpetuated in what is viewed as the cold, hard corporate world is not much different in the academy either. Until there is representation at the highest of levels, or at least close to it, power and access to power, where things are embedded, and they are embedded in every aspect as a common thread throughout your institution, that's when it becomes an exclusive place becomes inclusive is because now that person has a seat at the table. They're not this tangential, peripheral, you did programming. Programming is not a strategy. Programming is a tactic. And oftentimes our work will gladly be diminished as programming because we can put that in a newsletter and say, hey, we're woke. It's a different conversation. We're different. However, when I have to sit with you with a small group of power brokers within our institution and say, I'm going to pick on you, Donna, because you know my thoughts on you taking over this. But if I sit and say, well, Donna or Christina, whomever represents in the cabinet area, you and a relatively select few individuals, it's your turn to speak about your area of work and how it fits in within our mission and vision of what it is that we're trying to do. That is a totally different level of influence that you wield, as opposed to various rungs below that, to where you can easily be buried in the programming goings on of a robust institution. That is the only time where I have ever seen that level of change that you're speaking to ever be operationalized, is when there was a concerted effort to have representation, whether that started grassroots at the student level or the faculty level, or the administrative. The reason why I say the dynamic of faculty and administration, that's complicated. However, wherever it starts, if it can then reverberate upwards to where there becomes this concerted movement to get representation, we've seen that happen across campuses. There are many models to where the president of institutions has been somewhat compelled to give representation in spaces where otherwise they really weren't even considering it. That's really the only way, in an earnest way, where I see that there being such a overhaul that's really countercultural. That's what you're kind of talking about. That's the only way that you shift the culture, is now to embed it and have culture changers be able to do that. Everything else is somewhat tangential. It's marginal.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, I take it out. No. How do I do this? Hi. Sorry. I have a question that I kind of wrote down during your presentation, Dr. Fletcher. So just wondering, and for anybody, who has insight. You mentioned about making assumptions, that everyone kind of has the same needs, and I guess determining what initiatives, are implemented based on that. What would you say are like best practices for how to assess like what the needs actually are from employees? And does that differ depending on like the marginalized group, that you might be speaking to or trying to target?
That's a great question. As a matter of practice within organizations, if equity and inclusion is embedded in your organization, you should have levels of representation to counsel you to where it's firsthand. That's usually where ERGs come into play. If ERGs are robust, and ERGs are avenues or conduits to information that is supposed to be authentic, that's supposed to be representative of a group. When I was at Apple, they did it best from my experience in that space, to where their employee resource groups were ongoing, meaning as malleable as our social identities continue to be, they made space for anyone to self-nominate and say, we need representation in this organization. And they had a toolkit that allowed for them to create an ERG, and immediately they had a system where ERGs, they were part of the org chart almost, to where they weren't, but they almost were systemically, to where ERGs would galvanize and speak their needs, and they had almost an ombudsperson a liaison to the president to speak to their needs of what representation should look like. Now, that's from an overarching organizational standpoint, but now, again, just break that down into divisions. There should be representatives across. That's how you embed DEI into it, to where authentic lived needs and experiences, where that one size fits all approach I talk about doesn't really have an opportunity to seed into an organizational structure, is because you have a constant system that is working itself, that's allowing for authentic voices to tell you what they need. Now, whether they get done or not is a different level of it all. There are many demands or requests that's still sitting at Tim Cook's desk that never got done, but there was a system to feed them to the powers that be to get those done. If you reverse engineer it and you look at the way that the organization works, DEI is no different than how a well-functioning organization should work. It's very basic. It's just a matter of if you see where organizations are retrofitting DEI into it, it becomes like scar tissue to a wound. Like it's not going to fit. It's not natural. So at any chance you get, you're going to try and deny it and repel it and all that. All right. The times where I've seen it done well is when it is naturally woven into and viewed as a organizational, structural approach, as opposed to we're going to retrofit you into some slot. And then that's usually when you don't see those systemic throughputs where you have representation from like the Black at Apple or the Out and Open or the Persons with Disability. You had all of these groups who ultimately fed into the liaison. And if the liaison does their work, just like any well-functioning machine, then it's going to get to the powers that be. Now, getting that done, again, like I said, is a much more complicated conversation.
We have one last question from Jackie.
This one's for Tim, and I'm just kind of thinking about the restoration record being like a universal tool, essentially, or that's something that has a potential to be a universal tool. On the recruitment side, on the hiring side, and I'm just wondering if there's any thought or consideration to partnering with an entity that has expertise to then provide the retention side of that. So how can we put something like that out there that has the potential to be utilized in grand scale, paired with the expertise to truly have people, organizations have the kind of training and in-depth education that their people need to have in order to truly support and retain individuals who've faced these systemic barriers, throughout their lives, and not end up having them basically kind of following similar dead-end paths, right? So the recruitment and the hiring end is there. We're bringing folks in and bringing in the talent that's been missing, but then we don't have the knowledge and the education and the training, for people to understand, again, those systemic barriers that people are facing so that they can then be retained and supported throughout their employment.
Thank you for that question. There's an app for that. Literally. So Jody Anderson, I'll plug Jody Anderson, has developed an app called ResMe, and it's in its pilot phase. But what that does is, I think part of your question is, and sort of your commentary, which I totally agree with, is if we address the access point, right, which is all the restorative record does really, is try to open up the access point. We fail to account for all the challenges Aaron has talked about with people with disabilities, and we heard with veterans, which is, okay, you're in the door now, but you have no workforce supports, no opportunities to advance. So what do we do with that? And so what I would just mention is that part of this, the grand vision, if you will, is to bring in workforce development professionals, to bring in HR And that's part of the qualitative studies that we'll do. We'll say, here's the app, here's our project, what do you need to make this work for you from each of the stakeholders? But part of what we've already learned is, one, there are workforce development agencies, let's take New York, for example, covering every aspect of somebody's progression through work. In most of the regions throughout New York and many other states, they're all siloed, they don't work together, and there's no one place to locate where they all are. ResMe has tried to build for that, to put all of the contact information, all of the resources for workforce supports for justice impacted individuals. Again, this could be replicated for other populations, to say, okay, you've used our metrics for hiring, meaning the restorative record. You've made a decision to hire. We're connecting you now to these workforce development organizations that can be a support. Some of them even provide transportation for the individual, which we know is a huge hurdle, and other kinds of things. And then the next piece of this app, ResMe by Jody Anderson, is upskilling opportunities and micro-credentialing. So trying to, again, bring together all the opportunities that exist, namely free. We're developing a partnership with Cornell, who's in the room, that has all kinds of wonderful resources for individuals that can access, and making sure that the individual can get all these upskilling opportunities that may not cost, they don't have to go get a 4-year college degree, or maybe that's the initiation point to begin that journey. But I'll just say, I do think technology, in one line, technology is probably the solution for this. I think that we're going to need the help of that to really impact at scale. But I think your point is really well taken, which is, if we stop at the access point, we're really missing out on really what we're trying to do, which is to improve economic advancement, entrepreneurism, not just for jobs, but to actually, have one's own company.
Thank you. We had one last. Okay.
Thank you all so much for what you've shared today. It's been really wonderful. I think a lot of what you've suggested is kind of big systemic changes at the institutional level. And as someone who's part of a small mini institute, we're doing a lot of hiring right now and thinking about what we can do, what kinds of changes we can make at our level, right, that aren't Cornell policy changes, for example. Do you have any sort of concrete suggestions, especially for attracting candidates, to kind of indicate that, yes, we are an inclusive place to work and we do have resources and supports? One thing that we've been doing just on our own is, when we get applications in, our manager takes out all the names from all the resumes and cover letters and everything. So we blindly are reviewing these and have no idea of whatever information you could try to glean from someone's name. And I think that's a nice little thing, but that's certainly not, bringing people in. That's just something we do on our end. But anyway, just some ideas. If you have any other kind of concrete suggestions, I would appreciate it.
So concrete suggestions to help to show that you are an inclusive workforce?
Yes, ways
to kind of show the public that you're looking for candidates who are diverse?
Yes.
Okay.
I do think there's the practical piece of, advertising, really broadening where you're advertising your postings. And again, there's all types of networks and job boards out there that are geared towards different marginalized populations and identities. And I think what Patricia said earlier is so key, which is we don't look local enough. We have plenty of people locally. But I also think, and this isn't going to be a direct answer to your question, but so much of what I've been hearing today from the questions and from the panelists, I think are making me kind of want to say this, which is, sometimes I think we look at inclusion as sort of the end goal, when actually it's an approach. It's an approach. We need to be doing the things that we're doing in an inclusive manner, and regardless of how it turns out. So, when I totally hear the question earlier about this is an exclusive organization. So how do we be inclusive? Well, how we be inclusive is by applying an inclusive approach to how we are reviewing resumes. What are we considering qualifications? What are we considering the skills and and we've heard all day today from Tim, from Deborah, all the different types of skills. And what are we considering the quote experience? And are we shifting our definition of those words so that that's opening us up to a broader pool of people that we are considering? That's an inclusive approach, and I think that's the more we could be signaling that we are using, different ways, breaking from that status quo of how we are considering candidates and how we are reviewing them, just inherently going to lead to better results, I think.
So I'm going to talk about, a little bit, elaborate on this on two fronts. One thing is there are a number of local organizations that are of the minoritized populations. They don't work, well, some work with, others are of the minoritized populations, reaching out to those organizations in town, establishing networks with them, and becoming collaborators, not just the occasional visitor. I think that would be a very important thing. It's a long-term job. It's not something that's going to yield instantaneous results, but it would lead to longer-term change. Another thing is going back to how we recruit. In my other role as for the Department of Astronomy, I am the coordinator of a program for undergraduate researchers. We recruit students who are not Cornell students to bring them here for the summer. And last year, and what we implemented this year, a whole new set of questions that were focused more on certain types of characteristics. We were, rather than just try to identify who does well in Calc 3, we were looking at, let's try to identify students who are resilient, students who are creative problem solvers, students who have initiative. So rather, we're sort of changing the definition of what we are looking for. And I think that goes a long way to recruiting a different sort of workforce. I think recruiting differently will require creative lateral thinking. There is a wealth of talent in this county. For one thing, we have a lot of people from other countries who come with foreign credentials. Sometimes they are the spouses of someone who was hired to work here, whether the spouse is an American citizen or not. These people sometimes don't speak perfect English. They have their work experience is from another country. Their credentials are from other countries. They don't necessarily know how the system works here. Our system tends to undervalue their credentials just because they're from another country and therefore become instantly kind of suspect. We don't really know what this, yes, you may be a doctor in your country, but I don't know if, I would trust you with a, broken nail. Maybe not to that extent, but there's a very definite undervaluing of foreign credentials. And also, people don't know how to get their credentials evaluated so that they have at least some form of value here. That kind of, creating processes to reach out to these people and tell them these are tools you can use so that we can assess your skills and your credentials would be already helpful. There really is. Tompkins County has been growing more than other counties around us, partly because of immigration. And again, there is a lot of talent there. It's waiting to be recruited.
Hey, I think we are at an end of our time together. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Fletcher, Patricia, Aaron, Dr. Clark, and Tim. Thank you. Can we give them a warm round of applause?
Thank you so much to all of you. I know it's been an impactful and inspiring day, and we're at the end. So we're going to ask that you remain where you are. And before you all leave, I just want to say a special thank you to all of you for being here. I know you've been here, most of you, since this morning. But before you leave, I want to say just a few words and special thank you to some individuals. And I first again want to say thank you to you. But we've come to the end of today's symposium, and my hope is that you're able to walk away inspired and committed to continuing the necessary work in the DEI space. Your passion and dedication are what is needed at this time when all our efforts under the DEI umbrella are being eroded, and when the importance of this work seems to no longer be understood or valued as an important and necessary undertaking. It is only a matter of time before this ideology fully breaches the shores of our academic institutions. I encourage each of you who are here today to make it your mission to continue this important work in your various spaces. Do not allow the vision to die. What's next, you're asking? Well, we're working on some very promising initiatives, and you will be hearing more about them over the next several months. So just stay tuned. We'll have information coming out for you. I want to take a few minutes just to thank a handful of individuals. I try not to be long. First, I want to thank the presidential advisors for diversity and equity for launching the Belonging at Cornell Innovation Grant, who are the sponsors of this event. I want to thank Avery August, Marla Love, and Sonia Rayner Rucker, and the entire leadership of Cornell University for their foresight in putting forward this initiative. I also want to thank our speakers, Dr. Shaun Fletcher, Dr. Kenneth Clark, Tim McNutt, Erin Sember Chase, and Deborah Howell. And I also would like to thank Patricia, and I'm going to call the whole name because I think it's so Patricia Fernandez de Castro de Martinez. Am I right? I got it. I learned Spanish in high school, so I have a little bit of the accent. So just want to say special thank you to all of you. Your presentations, your responses to the questions, I am so inspired. You know, I'm really inspired by what I heard today, and I hope that you are too, and I'm sure that our audience is. I ask at this time that you give a quick round of applause for them one more time just to say thank you. I want to thank you as a Cornell community for just coming out. It shows how important this conversation is, and the fact that you were willing to come and to stay throughout the day just to hear about this is very much appreciated. Thanks to all of our visiting guests. We had several guests from outside of Cornell and around the surrounding Ithaca community who are here with us. So I want to give you a special thank you. We appreciate your support, and we're happy that you took the time to join us, and I know that you're leaving inspired to carry on the work. Special thanks to the various schools and units for their support. We have some of the representatives here with the College of Arts and Sciences, which is me, the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and I say my partner in crime, Assistant Dean of HR, Larry. I'm not sure if he came back, but I want to thank him. Sandy, I'm going to ask you to stand up. Sandy's from the College of Human Ecology and one of my close colleagues. So thank you to Sandy. And then the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And Sonia, you're here to represent. Thank you so much. And last, and I also want to thank Cornell. I started out working with Carol Grobert, but she's not here today, so I want to publicly say thank you to her as well. I want to thank the photographer and our Cornell fantastic team for recording today's event. And that lets me know to remind you that the event is recorded, and within the next week, you will be able to access it and enjoy the fun a second time around. Last but not least, I want to thank the various staff in the Arts and Sciences Dean's Office who provided their support in various ways. All of our hostesses, my HR team, thank you so much. Melissa Stepanak, Tara Wilder, I don't see Lisa, and I'm not sure, Lisa Wishan, I'm not sure if Mary was here. I want to thank Pani. Thank you so much, Pani Love. She's in our Dean's office. And I'm missing a few others, but thank you guys so much for your support. I also want to thank our Dean's Assistant, Hannah Cohn-Manick, for single-handedly managing all the logistics for this event. Hannah, you have to stand up. Hannah looks, they're very quiet, and she just moves around a little bit, but I'm telling you, she's a little powerhouse. She pulls me off the brink because I tend to go overboard a lot of things, and she'll say, we don't really need to do that. I don't think we really need to do that. So it's just, but she's trying to be careful because I'm the HR director, she's the dean's assistant, so she's trying not to pull rank on me, you know. But Hannah, thank you so much. I've told that over and over. I could not have done this without you, so thank you. Our communications team, arts and sciences communications team, for our posters. You got tired of seeing them all over the campus, the emails, the invitations, the reminders again that came out. I want to thank them. I just want to thank all the staff of the Dean's Office in Arts and Sciences. Please feel free to stay back and conduct some networking with our team. They will be here. They're not running to go anywhere. I guarantee you that. I've already warned them to stay back so you can have your conversations with them. Can you hear my voice? Yes, I can. Will you take the time to care? Yes, I will. Thank you again for being here. And to all, good night. Don't run away. I'm not.